I'm Dr. Giobbi. Welcome to the podcast. To this week's episode, we're going to begin looking at science in the 18th century. That is, the history and the philosophy of science as it's manifesting in the 1700s. So this week's episode will be looking specifically at empiricism, sensationalism, and positivism. Starting around 1650 with the thinkers, with René Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon, and entering into our discussion today of the 18th century, this is a period known as the Enlightenment period, the scientific revolution. We might consider the architecture and the music of the time. This is a classical architecture, and classical period of music, the 1700s. This is the time of Haydn and Mozart, and this is an emphasis on structure and form and logic and relationship. I would say that the classical period, that this period of enlightenment was really an emphasis on thinking over feeling. Well, let's look at some of those thinkers. At this point in history, there were really three trends: empiricism, rationalism, and romanticism. These three trends existed strongly in different cultures, and specifically different cultures throughout Europe during this period of time. We're going to look at all three of these. Romanticism, the German Romanticism, becomes very strong in the 19th century. Rationalism is very strong in Germany and in Italy at this time period, and in the British world, British culture, empiricism was very dominant in thinking. What is empiricism? Well, epistemologically, empiricism is the idea that all knowledge comes through the senses. This is really in distinction and reaction to the Cartesian model, in which the mind actively thinks about things that come through the senses. If Descartes was a rationalist, then the empiricists were more interested in knowing how the senses bring in information and how that information is associated in the mind. But the emphasis was on the claim that knowledge first comes through the senses. That's empiricism. Now, when we speak of the British empiricists, we're usually talking about Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and David Hume. Just to make a further distinction of the idea of empiricism, in empiricism, all knowledge comes through the senses, all knowledge comes through experiencing. This would be in contrast to the idea that we could sit and think about something and imagine it and attain knowledge from the imagination or from the fantasy of something that didn't really happen. That would be rationalism. So when empiricists speak of experience, they're specifically speaking of sensory experience. The internal experience of the mental world is not what they're referring to. It's actually what they're referring against. Consider the definition of empiricism put forth by Robinson. Empiricism is the epistemology that asserts that the evidence of sense constitutes the primary data of all knowledge, that knowledge cannot exist unless this evidence has first been gathered, and that all subsequent intellectual processes must use this evidence, and only this evidence, in framing valid propositions about the real world. So once again, we're looking at the primary basis of knowledge in empiricism as being the sensory knowledge, and that there might be other knowledge, but empiricists are really talking about where knowledge comes from. Talk about an animated fellow. Thomas Hobbes was born in 1588, died in 1679 in Wiltshire, England, and he's the kind of guy who played tennis until he was 70, and also when he was in his 80s, for fun, he made an English transcription of the Iliad and the Odyssey, just for fun, and published it. This was a very energetic, long-lived, fully lived British philosopher. He was friends with Descartes. They exchanged letters. And he's also known as the father of British empiricism. So let's have a little thumbnail sketch of Hobbes. Hobbes was a mechanist. He was a reductionist as well as an empiricist. So as an empiricist, he felt that all knowledge came through experiencing through the senses. As a mechanist, he felt that all thinking, all experience, all knowledge fit together in a machine-like way, in a mechanistic way. This is in a tradition that begins with Sir Isaac Newton in the mechanistic clockwork view of the universe. Hobbes felt, too, that thinking was mechanistic, that human experience was very mechanistic, and that we could examine the mechanism and come to understand how it works. And reductionistic, that means that everything could be reduced down, all knowledge, all thinking could be reduced down to empirical sensory experiences. So we have these three traditions that are very strong in empiricism: mechanism, reductionism, as part of empiricism. And we might find a useful parallel in thinking about 20th century behaviorism. So behaviorists the American behaviorists of the 20th century were very much informed by the British empiricists. Hobbes also put forth a view of human nature. He felt that all human activity was an attempt to reduce pain and increase pleasure, which is another similarity with behaviorism. And he also put forth the social theory in which he felt that society was put in place to prevent fighting. In 1635, Hobbes had a visit with Galileo, and he was very moved by Galileo's description of a mechanistic, lawful, natural world. This got Thomas Hobbes to thinking, well, humans are part of the natural world. Of course, aren't humans lawful and mechanistic as well? And he put forth his theory that humans were machines. Listen to this quote: "For seeing life is but motion of limbs, for what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body." Now this is the mechanistic view of Hobbes. This is the idea that we can understand human beings as machines, naturally occurring machines. We also see an early example of the politics of science. Hobbes was extremely popular in Britain. He was an institution in British culture, yet he was not inducted into the British Royal Society. The president was Bacon, and Hobbes and Bacon had completely different views of how science should be done. And the British Royal Society was dominated by Baconians, people who did the inductive reasoning, used Bacon's inductive method. And true to what Kuhn has described for us, if the individuals who held those purse strings of power didn't allow others in. So despite Hobbes' popularity, he wasn't a part of the Royal Society. Now, Hobbes felt that at the base, human beings were naturally aggressive, selfish, and greedy. So for him, the idea of democracy was not a good idea. He endorsed monarchy. He felt this was the only way that these natural aggressive drives could be controlled in a society. Schopenhauer, the German romantic, would later quote Thomas Hobbes' position that man is a wolf to man. For Hobbes, civilization or society is a reaction against the fear of death. So I like to view Hobbes as viewing human nature as almost like a power-hungry children who need some sort of parental authority to keep these desires for power in check, and that would be the monarchy. So these political views were published in Hobbes' book Leviathan in 1651, and he really alienated himself from the Catholic Church and from anyone who would have an interest in anything but a monarchy, because he basically said that the church should submit to the power of the monarchy. It's also an example of a psychological treatise in that Hobbes' political theory is based on his view of human nature. After Leviathan was published, 1666, a motion was put forth to Parliament that Hobbes should be burned at the stake for being an atheist, and publishing this book, and the monarchy stepped in and prevented this from taking place. Now, Hobbes emphasized in science using the deductive method and also relying on the senses. He was an empiricist. In his own words, "The origin of all thoughts is that which we can sense, for there is no conception in a man's mind which hath not at first totally or by parts been begotten upon the organs of the senses. The rest are derived from that original." So we see here someone who is clearly an empiricist and using the deductive method. As a materialist, Hobbes felt that the mind was nothing but matter in motion. In contemporary terms, we see this type of mechanism and reductionism and materialism in neuroscience, when we hear explanations of neurons firing and synapses and different neurotransmitters functioning. This is really a matter in motion view of the mind. To return to empiricism. Now, when it comes to psychological phenomena, Hobbes was a monist. He didn't believe that there was a distinction between the physical and the mental. It was one substance. As a monist, this is his starting point. Hobbes defined attention as a focus on moving sensory objects. Not unlike contemporary cognitive psychology, imagination and memory were simply traces of sensory experience, and dreams were merely memory and fantasy during sleep. Hobbes also put forth the idea that dreams were vivid while we sleep because there was no interference from other sensory data at that time, and the sensory data of the mind became the forefront of attention. Hobbes also felt that the human body reacted to stimulus in either pleasure or unpleasurable ways, and this creates an appetite towards pleasure. And we actually have a physical relationship with our senses. For Hobbes, love and hate, good and bad, could be reduced to pleasure and pain, things that felt good versus things that did not feel good. For Hobbes, there was no free will. Individuals developed a certain pattern of reacting to their own bodily sensations of pleasure and pain. The idea of freedom was simply just a word that one put on this experience of thinking that they were choosing how to act. And not unlike Aristotle's position of laws of contiguity, Hobbes put forth a theory of of sensory material being organized in memory as mental events and associated into knowledge. And this was drawing on the Aristotelian tradition. So that's our introduction to British empiricism and the father of British empiricism, Thomas Hobbes. In our next part, we'll be turning to John Locke. Hi, welcome to part 2 of episode 5 of the podcast. We're looking at the 18th century and the scientific revolution during the Enlightenment. Today we'll be taking an in-depth look at John Locke. John Locke was a British empiricist who was born in 1632 and he died in 1704. Very much in the tradition of Descartes, Locke was a dualist. He proposed a body and a mind, or body and spirit split, which was very different from Hobbes' monist view of empiricism. Now, Locke wrote extensively on many topics, everything from a translation of Aesop's fables for children to learn Latin, to scientific treatises, and his most famous work was published in 1690, entitled An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, and it really outlines his view of epistemology, of early psychology. A thumbnail sketch of Locke's views might go something like this. All ideas come from the senses, thus he's an empiricist. The mind does play an active role in organizing those ideas. He does make a distinction between the physical and the mental, so he is a dualist. And also that all human emotions are based on pleasure and pain, so we see this continuation of the empiricist's view of pleasure and pain as fundamental emotions. Locke also made a distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. He felt that primary qualities were objective physical qualities, and that secondary qualities were psychological compounds that were birthed in the mind. Locke was a very good friend and correspondent with Isaac Newton, as he was with Voltaire. There were letters that were written between them and had much camaraderie in their intellectual positions. As we find in much of philosophy and intellectual history, we can agree with parts of an individual's ideas and greatly disagree with other aspects of their ideas. And this is true between Locke and Descartes. Although Locke did share with Descartes his dualist view, he did not share with Descartes the idea that the mind had a priori knowledge. So we can read the essay concerning human understanding of 1690 as a reaction against Descartes. Here's a quote from the text, from Locke's text. Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. In that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. Our observations employed either about the external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds perceived and reflected on ourselves is that which supplies our understanding with all the material of thinking. These two are the foundations of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have or can naturally have do spring. So Locke's concept of the idea is any type of mental phenomenon that occurs. And the idea can have its roots in the sensation or in reflection. I think we can think of this in contemporary neuroscientific terms or cognitive terms as top-down versus bottom-up processing. For Locke, the idea coming from sensation would be a bottom-up processes, and the idea coming from reflection would be a top-down, it's like today's contemporary top-down processes. So, true to the empiricist's tradition, all ideas begin with sensation, but they become arranged by operations of the mind. In his text, Locke also described some basic functions of the mind. These would be perception, thinking, doubting, believing, reasoning, knowing, and willing. This is the acts of the mind that act on the stimulus that comes from the sensation. So we see here that Locke opposed a priori or innate knowledge, but he did not oppose a priori or innate operations, faculties of the mind. As was fashionable with the associationist way of thinking, there was an idea of ideas. There were simple ideas and complex ideas. Ideas were thought to be things that could be broken down into little pieces called simple ideas or basic ideas. These would be sensations or thoughts on reflections, and then these ideas could be combined into more complex ideas. In Locke's own words, simple ideas, the materials of all our knowledge, are suggested and furnished to the mind only by sensation or reflection. When the understanding is one stored with these simple ideas, it has the power to repeat, compare, and unite them, even to an almost infinite variety, so can make at pleasure new complex ideas. So this is an example where Locke is seeing that sensory material or even ideas that appear in the mind can be arranged into different systems of knowledge. Locke felt that the mind could neither create nor destroy ideas, just arrange them in different ways. It was common in the 18th century to refer to emotions as passions. It's a very interesting word, passions. But Locke proposed that the emotions were shaping forces and also associated with different ideas. So these shaping forces, these emotions or passions, were love, desire, joy, hatred, sorrow, anger, fear, despair, envy, shame, and hope. And they were derived from the two basic emotions of pleasure and pain. Now, the idea of primary and secondary qualities, or these different levels of reality and knowing things in the real and through a subjective experience, this wasn't new with Locke. Galileo had mentioned these ideas. Some of our ancient Greek philosophers had discussed this idea. But Locke, drawing on his friend Robert Boyle's terminology of primary and secondary qualities, described them as such. Locke's conception of these primary and secondary qualities were framed a little differently. He felt that ideas could come from both primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities, though, were things that actually existed in the physical object. Secondary qualities were things that were ideas produced in the mind, such as color, sound, temperature, and taste, the qualities. There's a famous experiment done by William James. And James first learned of this experiment that he would use in the Harvard classroom for his Intro to Psychology's Principles of Psychology course. And it's called The Paradox of the Basins. And Locke wrote about this. And Locke would describe that you could have an individual put three buckets of water, an ice-cold bucket on the left, in the middle, a room temperature bucket of water, and on the right, a very hot, scalding hot bucket of water. He would then have an individual place their hands, right and left hand, in the cold bucket, and one in the right in the hot bucket, then remove both hands and place them into the center room temperature bucket. And of course, the perception of the middle bucket would be differing in each hand. Coming from the ice cold, the middle bucket would feel hot. Coming from the hot water, the middle bucket would feel cold. And this was an example of the secondary qualities of perception and how perception is framed by what comes before it. Locke also felt that the subjective experience could be studied scientifically. This is where he he differed from Galileo. And Locke was very much an associationist in this way. And the idea of association is that the entirety of cognition, of mental life, is making associations between ideas, joining ideas in a way that we call knowledge. It's interesting to note that Locke felt that learning involved a degree of madness. It was basically the introduction and repetitive association between different ideas until those two ideas became somehow connected. And this is why he referred to it as a degree of madness. He also demonstrated that this is how faulty beliefs came to be, that sometimes ideas could be associated in ways that were convincingly true to the individual thinking, but did not correspond to reality. And so this was highly influenced by culture, by education, by chance, by custom, and just by error. Faulty reasoning could result. So once again, we see great similarities with the later behaviorists in associative learning, or what we have come to call classical conditioning. Maybe one of the most significant books for practical psychologists would be Locke's 1693 text, Some Thoughts Concerning Education, where he actually describes personality theory or character development. Some of the child-rearing practices that Locke described in that text, because he felt that education should start in the home, might be a little suspect today. He actually encouraged parents to increase their children's stress tolerance by having them take cold baths instead of hot baths and sleep on hard surfaces, just to prepare them for the difficulties of life, to make them more emotionally and physically hardy. Not unlike John B. Watson, later he would discourage parents from allowing their children to cry and to show unnecessary or excessive affection with their children. Here's Locke's parenting advice on children with irrational fears. Your child shrieks and runs away at the sight of a frog. Let another child catch it and lay it down at a good distance from him. At first, accustom him to look upon it. When he can do that, then come nearer to it, and so it leap without emotion. Then to touch it lightly when it's held fast in another's hand, and so on, till he can come to handle it confidently as a butterfly or a sparrow. Now, this is a very interesting, very precise description of the behavioral technique of desensitization. Politically speaking, Locke was very influential, and is certainly influential in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. His political writings on liberty and social contract were part of the foundation of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Locke felt that the key was democracy, where people could intelligently discuss and arrive at a common conclusion. But of course, central to a successful democracy for Locke was a logical and well-educated citizenry. In part 3 of episode 5, we'll be turning to Bishop Berkeley and David Hume. We will then be turning to the British sensationalists on Dr. Giobbi Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Hi, I'm Dr. Giobbi. Welcome to the podcast. This is part 3 of episode 5, dealing with the history of psychology during the 18th century. It's the classical period, and what we're looking at is the Enlightenment, scientific revolution. Now, today we're going to be looking specifically at Bishop Berkeley, George Berkeley. And then in the next episode, we'll be looking at David Hume. First, let's take a little thumbnail sketch of Bishop Berkeley. Basically, what Bishop Berkeley put forth was the idea that there was no physical world. There were only perceptions. That means the only thing that we have any contact with is our sensory and perceptual representations of what could possibly be understood as a physical world. So the physical world itself is actually only perception. And he didn't deny that there was not an external world, but he felt that only God could perceive the external world, and that God actually allows our perceptions to be accurate. So this is the way we can think of Bishop Berkeley in a nutshell. We have no physical world. Our physical world is in actuality our perceptual system. It's all virtual, in other words. And there is some sort of external world. We do not know it, but it aligns accurately by God's effort with our perceptual world. That's a thumbnail sketch of Bishop Berkeley. Now, David Hume, we can sometimes think of as Berkeley to the extreme. Hume said there's absolutely no physical reality whatsoever. That there's no physical reality. We only directly experience our subjective experience. That's all there is. It's complete subjective perception in our minds. There's no experience of physical world, only thoughts and habits. And these habits, these thoughts are governed by laws of association. That's the law of contiguity, law of resemblance, and law of cause and effects. In other words, our minds are a priori set up to experience cause and effect relationships, to actually experience relationships in a cause and effect way. Things that resemble one another in the way they sound and the way they look, we group together, we bind them together in our thinking through resemblance. And contiguity, things that are close together, things that occur in the same space at the same time, we tend to group together in our experience of these things. And all emotion, all things governing behavior is emotion. Emotion is at the driving seat of behavior. And that's David Hume in a thumbnail sketch. Now, Bishop George Berkeley was born in 1685 and died in 1753. He was born in Kilkenny, Ireland, and first went to Kilkenny College and then transferred to Trinity College, which is now University of Dublin. And this is where he graduated from with his bachelor's degree and his master's degree. He became ordained deacon in the Anglican Church by the time he was 24 years old. And he wrote his major works dealt with vision, perception, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. So he was looking at perception, sensation, and epistemology, the very things that we today look at in cognitive psychology. It's very interesting to note that when he was in his early 40s, Bishop Berkeley traveled to colonial America, where he intended to set up a college in Bermuda. And the college never received its funding. He eventually sailed to Newport, Rhode Island, and spent some time there waiting for the funding to come through. It never came through. Eventually returned to Ireland and became an Anglican bishop there. There's still a museum in Rhode Island near Newport in Whitehall, of the museum of where Berkeley lived while he was in Rhode Island. It might also be interesting to note that Berkeley College, University College of Berkeley, was named after Bishop Berkeley. Bishop Berkeley was aware that the attack on Aristotle and the fall of scholasticism, as well as the rise of the new philosophy of materialism, was really threatening the foundations of religious belief. the idea that everything was matter in motion, the empiricist view that everything was matter in motion, and that everything could be expressed and represented by mathematical formulas, was really pushing God out of the picture. Later we'll see Nietzsche brings this to our attention as well regarding science. Well, Bishop Berkeley was aware that this was going to be a problem. He thought this was dangerous, and it was dangerous for morality. It was dangerous for the human spirit to do away with God, or maybe more so dangerous to put so much faith in the empirical. So Bishop Berkeley knew he had to do something. He had to come up with a theory that would counter this trend. And so he attacked empiricism, and he attacked it, the assumptions where they're based at whether or not matter exists. This was his basic assumption. The question, does matter actually exist? So Berkeley put forth the idea that matter does not exist, and therefore all materialist philosophy is incorrect. So he agreed with Locke in that knowledge is based on ideas, but he disagreed with John Locke. Berkeley disagreed with John Locke in that it was founded in the physical world. For Bishop Berkeley, everything was perception. It was all of reality is a perceived virtuality. So for Berkeley, only secondary qualities existed, perceptions, and he called these. He had different aspects of the secondary qualities. Well, one that he referred to as supposed attributes, and the other perceptions. But the key here is that they were both, in the Lockean idea, they were both secondary qualities. They were both perceptions. So a question that this brings up is, does reality cease to exist once perception ends? In other words, if there's no one to perceive, is there a physical world? This brings a very interesting question that's going to come back in postmodern thought and 20th century thought, which is the phenomenology or the participatory nature of reality. It also raises a question of whether or not we all perceive the same thing. If everything is perceptions, then how do we know that all of our perceptions are the same, and do we know that they are the same? In his own words, I do not argue against the existence of any one thing that we can apprehend, either by sense or reflection. That the things I see with my eyes and touch with my hands do exist, really exist, I make not the least question. The only things whose existence we deny is that which philosophers call matter of corporeal substance. So then what creates reality? Well, for Bishop Berkeley, that was God. God's perception, and then God puts that perception into us. That's our experience of reality. So we're experiencing reality through God. We're experiencing the physical world through God as perceptions. It might sound quaint, however, if we simply replace the word God with the word mind or brain, the brain braining or the brain minding, and suddenly we discuss a contemporary theory that's very similar, that we do not experience the physical world, we experience the physical world through the mind. As a matter of fact, this is how Bishop Berkeley explained miracles. It's by God changing the laws of physics. Our senses, our perceptions, are nothing more than ideas in God's mind. And in a famous quote, to be is to be perceived. Berkeley was also one of the first to propose that each of the senses delivered a different aspect of information. In his words, by sight I have the ideas of light, colorous, with their several degrees and variations. By touch I perceived hard and soft, heat and cold, motion and resistance, and of all these more and less either as to quantity or degree. Smelling furnishes me with odors, the palate with tastes, and hearing conveys sounds to the mind in all their variety of tone and composition. And as several of these are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name, and so to be reputed as one thing. Thus, for example, a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistence, having been observed together, go together, are counted one distinct thing signified by the name apple, Other collections of ideas constitute a stone, a tree, a book. So you can understand how these different attributes of things, these different elemental attributes, form the thing itself. Berkeley also put together a theory of perception, of vision and distance, in which he did some thought experiments describing the experience of individuals who are blind. Listen to this fragment of Berkeley's regarding theory of distance perception. Sitting in my study, I hear a coach drive along the street. I look through this casement to see it. I walk out and enter into it. Thus, common speech would incline one to think I heard, saw, and touched the same thing, to wit, the coach. It is nevertheless certain the ideas intromitted by each sense are widely different and distinct from each other, but having been observed constantly to go together, they are spoken of as one and the same thing. By the variation of the noise, I perceive the different distances of the coach, and that it approaches before I look out. Thus, by the ear, I perceive distance just after the same manner as I do by the eye. So we're seeing an integration here of the senses into a perceptual reality. This is also foundations of something that sounds very familiar called Gestalt psychology. And in so doing this, showing the education of the senses, we could say, in perceiving reality, what Berkeley's actually doing is attacking the old materialist view, the clockwork mathematical worldview put forth by Descartes. Descartes and others felt that everything could be distance perception could be understood through mathematics and through vision alone. And Berkeley's saying, no, it's much more complicated than this. And he's undermining the idea of mathematical lawfulness in doing so. Bishop Berkeley also put forth a bit of an analysis of the perception of distance, what in Gestalt psychology we would call size constancy. Listen to his own words. As we see distance, so we see magnitude, and we see both in the same way that we see shame or anger in the looks of a man. Those passions, remember the word passions refer to emotions, those emotions or those passions are themselves invisible. They are nevertheless let in by the eye along with colors and alterations of countenance, which are the immediate object of vision, and which signify them for no other reason than barely because they have been observed to accompany them, without which experience we should no more have taken blushing for a sign of shame than of gladness. So again, we see a world that is put together in a virtual reality and a perceptual reality based on some very basic laws of association. Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Giobbi. Welcome to the podcast. Episode 5, Part 4. We're going to be looking today at 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. David Hume is known as an extreme Bishop Berkeley. Hume said we only directly experience our subjective world, and there's no physical world. There's no experience of the physical world, only thoughts and habits. He also has described 3 laws of association. That's contiguity, resemblance, and cause and effect. And all behavior is governed by emotions. So let's take a look now in depth at David Hume. Hume was born in 1711, died in 1776, and he was educated at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Hume's most famous work was published in first volume in 1739, second volume in 1740. It's called The Treatise of Human Nature, being an attempt to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects. In Hume's own words, it fell dead born from the press, without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots. But 2 years later, he wrote a smaller work called The Philosophical Essays, and that work was received very well. He thought that maybe it wasn't what he had to say in the Treatise for Human Nature, but maybe how he said it. So in 1748, he published an abbreviated version of it, and it's called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And this has really become the work that most folks know regarding David Hume. Hume was never able to acquire an academic position. He worked in various positions through non-academic positions, even was a private tutor and a librarian. And it was thought that his radical ideas against the church probably played a role in the fact that he never received an academic position. Listen to his argument about religion. In the first place, fear of God and the expectations of an afterlife have less day-to-day effect upon our conduct than is generally supposed. In the second place, religions do positive harm. They invent mortal sins like suicide, which have no natural depravity, and they create frivolous merits which partake in no natural good, like abstaining from certain foods or attending ceremonies. Moreover, religions result in cruel persecutions, bigotry, strife between sects, and between sects and civil power, and the hunting down of unorthodox opinions. So he was quite hostile towards religion. And of course, many of the university systems were religiously based. Hume was a very good friend of the economist Adam Smith. In fact, one of his manuscripts, the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, Hume left with Adam Smith and asked him to have it published after his death, but Smith didn't do this. And it was thought that he was probably fearful that the church would persecute him. So the manuscript actually didn't appear until 1779, and the publisher didn't sign their name to it. This just gives us a feel for what it's like at this time period, even as late as the mid-1700s, regarding church power. So Hume was really an Enlightenment thinker. He was interested in science, but he had a very broad definition of what science is. Science for Hume included mathematics, philosophy, religion, logic, morals, criticism, and politics. Science was very broad in Hume's definition. Regarding studying human ambitions, listen to this as from Hume's mouth. As the science of man is the only solid foundation for the other sciences, so the only solid foundation we can give to this science itself must be laid on experience and observation. So clearly, Hume is an empiricist. Of course, Hume was wanting to make what he called moral philosophy, what we today call psychology, moral philosophy along the model of Newtonian physics. Physics has long served as the model for the other sciences. So it was common in the 18th century to refer to what we today call science as natural philosophy, and what we today call the social sciences would be moral philosophy. Hume was also a proponent of using experimentation in the moral philosophy and the social sciences. So it would be set up, an experiment might be set up by manipulating something in the environment and watching how the individual reacts to that environmental manipulation. That would be the extent of an experiment at this time. but these variables had to be measurable and observable. Hume tended to use more inductive methods than deductive methods, so he's more in line with Bacon than Newton when it comes to how to structure knowledge. It's like Bishop Berkeley. Hume felt that there was no experience of a physical world, only the experience of a perceptual world. Listen to Hume in his own words. It is a question of fact whether the perceptions of the senses be produced by external objects resembling them. How shall this question be determined? By experience, surely, as all other questions of a like nature. But here experience is and must be entirely silent. The mind has never anything present to it but the perceptions, and cannot possibly reach any experience of their connection with objects. The supposition of such connection is, therefore, without any foundation in reasoning. So here we see that there's the thinking and ideas are a psychological phenomenon. If there is any physical reality, Hume proposed, there's no way for us to have any contact with it. So what Hume is really emphasizing here is our inability to know any physical world. When faced with the question about, is there a physical world, is there a body, Hume would say, well, we have to assume there is, but we have no knowledge of it. As far as these mental events are concerned, Hume talked about impressions, which were very strong, vivid perceptions, and ideas, which were weak perceptions. Listen to this. All the perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves into two distinct kinds, which I shall call impressions and ideas. The difference betwixt these consists in the degrees of force and liveliness with which they strike upon the mind and make their way into our thoughtful or consciousness. Those perceptions which enter with most force and violence we may name impressions. And under this name I comprehend all our sensations, our passions, and emotions, as they make their first appearance in the soul. By ideas, I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning. So we see here an understanding of experience that's a little different than how we think about experience today. Hume postulated that simple and complex ideas would exist in the mind, and the simple and complex ideas could mix and become what we would refer to as imagination. And we should make sense that at one point, all ideas started as impressions. So impressions came through the senses, they made an immediate impact, and then the trace of these, or the memories of these, would what we today call memory of the experience, would be what Hume called ideas. When these ideas consistently occur together, that's the basis for belief, according to Hume, and these beliefs become our reality. So we start with impressions. Impressions become ideas. The ideas become the imagination. As the ideas occur together more and more frequently, it becomes a belief, and that belief is our reality. So although knowledge comes from the senses, as an empiricist, once that knowledge is in the mind, it can be arranged in many different ways. Hume said this: the idea of God as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those qualities of goodness and wisdom. So in fact, what he's saying here is that God does not necessarily have to be an existing entity in order for us to have thoughts about godlike ideas. So once these impressions enter into the mind, become ideas, these ideas then seemingly swim around in the mind like fish, and they end up coming together or drawing together and becoming associated in three different ways. The three different laws of how ideas become associated. Let's put it this way: how memories become formed into our memory is called the law of resemblance, the law of contiguity, and the law of cause and effect. Law of cause and effect states that when we think of an outcome, an effect, we tend to also think of an event that typically precedes that outcome. So this is the idea of cause and effect, and when these two things occur together, we infer onto this that A caused B. Law of contiguity states that when one thinks of an object, there's a tendency to recall other objects that were experienced at the same time. And the law of resemblance states that our thoughts run easily from one idea to similar ideas. And in this way, the three laws shape the ideas into our beliefs, which become our reality. This way, in the 18th century, cause and effect became very popular because it was thought that if you could identify a cause, you could predict the future event. But for Hume, this was not the case. For Hume, causation was not necessary. All that was necessary was that two events regularly occurred together. That alone was enough for the mind to infer cause and effect. Hume put forth four necessary qualities that must be present to conclude that there's a causal relationship between two things. Number one, the cause and effect must be contiguous in space and time. So one follows the other in space and in time. The cause must be prior to the effect. There must be a constant union between the cause and effect. It is chiefly this quality that constitutes the relation. So it's the regularity of the relationship that gives it the cause and effect designation. And the same cause always produces the same effect, and the same effect never arises but from the same cause. So it is consistent. But Hume also pointed out that there was no guarantee that these causal references or inferences will continue to happen. So just because it always happens this way in one's experience doesn't mean it's going to continue to be the case. We see that for Hume, everything is imagination, everything is belief, whether that be metaphysical entities like God or the soul. It also is true for matter, for science, for philosophy, even for the thing, me, myself. That the I, myself, is all a product of the mind. It's all perceptual. Listen to this. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long am I insensible of myself, and may truly be said not to exist. And where all my perceptions removed by death, I neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate. After dissolution of the body, I should be entirely annihilated. This is interesting. Hume's saying that when we fall asleep, we lose ourselves, that we don't exist when we're sleeping. As we said, for Hume, the emotions are what guide the behaviors. Listen to this. It is universally acknowledged that there is a great uniformity among the actions of men in all nations and all ages, and that human nature remains still the same in its principles and its operations. The same motives always produce the same actions. The same events follow from the same causes. Ambition, avarice, self-love, vanity, friendship, generosity, public spirit, these passions, mixed with various degrees and distributed through society, have been from the beginning of the world and still are the source of all the actions and enterprises which have ever been observed among mankind. What Hume's saying here is that emotion drives behavior, and that it is true for human beings regardless of place or time period. So in this early psychology, what Hume is saying is that if you can identify an individual's patterns of emotions, that is what we call their character, or today what we call their personality, the pattern of their emotional content. Interestingly, Hume proposed a bit of a personality theory that is based on weather forecasting, which is an idea that has resurfaced in the 20th century of psychology based on more forecasting type weather probabilities. Listen to this. The internal principles and motives may operate in a uniform manner, notwithstanding these seeming irregularities, in the same manner as the winds, the rain, clouds, and other variations of the weather are supposed to be governed by steady principles, though not easily discoverable by human sagacity and enquiry. Not unlike the behaviorists that will appear in the 20th century, Hume felt that all human behavior was governed by reward and punishment. He said this is true for dogs, cats, and people. It is all reward and punishment schedules. He also added that it doesn't matter how much someone thinks. All reason aside, it comes down to reward and punishment, pleasure and pain. These words are very striking. We speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk of the combat of passion and of reason. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. So what Hume is actually saying here is that we will use our rationality and our logic to the service of our emotions. And this is a theme that will come in the future, in the 19th century with psychoanalysis, and the 20th century with attribution theory. In part 5 of episode 5, we'll be concluding our look at empiricism. And that will be an exploration of the ideas of David Hartley, James Mill, and John Stuart Mill. See you next time. Hi, this is Dr. Giobbi. Welcome to the podcast of the history of psychology. And this week we've been looking at British empiricism. In today's episode, we're going to be having a brief introduction to David Hartley, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, and the French counterparts to the British empiricists, the sensationalists. That's today on the Dr. Giobbi podcast. British empiricist David Hartley was born in 1705 and died in 1757. And he's mostly known as the person who combined empiricism with associationism. Associationism is the idea that ideas are combined in the mind to form more complex ideas or reality itself. So we have empiricism and associationism. And what Hartley laid forth was how the laws of association can explain behavior. And he showed how we could habitually fall into associations that then resulted in external behavior. He also showed that reflexes, he hypothesized that reflexes became associated with physical stimulus, which then became habitual behavior, and also that pleasure and pain govern behavior. And that's something that we see is true of all of the empiricists, that pleasure and pain seem to be fundamental attributes of human behavior. Now, someone who followed Hartley quite closely and built on Hartley's ideas of laws of associations was James Mill. James Mill felt that all experience was empiricism and associations. Listen to Mill's analysis of associations. The word gold, for example, or the word iron appears to express as simple an idea as the word color or the word sound. Yet it is immediately seen that the idea of each of these metals is made up of the separate ideas of several sensations: color, hardness, extensions, weight. Those ideas, however, present themselves in such intimate union that they are constantly spoken of as one, not as many. We say our idea of iron, our idea of gold, and it is only with an effort that reflecting men perform the decomposition. It is to this great law of association that we trace the formation of our ideas of what we call external objects. That is, the ideas of a certain number of sensations received together so frequently that they coalesce, as it were, and are spoken of under the idea of unity. Hence, what we call the idea of a tree, the idea of a stone, the idea of a horse, the idea of a man. So we see here is a description by James Mill of the laws of association and how association comes to construct all of reality. And he's also saying that a sensitive thinker can look at their reality and break it down into its basic sensory empirical elements. Now, if you go to the University College of London, you may see something that's a little strange. There's something there called an auto-icon, which is a large wooden box with a glass front. In that box is the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham had himself publicly dissected and mummified and placed in this box. And at certain meetings during the college council, he'll be pulled out and listed as present but not voting. So he was a rather eccentric individual. And he was also friendly with James Mill. Well, Jeremy Bentham put forth an idea of utilitarianism. That was a very practical philosophy that was based on pleasure. And he felt that the best and the most ethical action, the best way for government to take action was that which benefited most people. So whomever benefited the most from something, that would be the course of action to take. Listen to Bentham in his own words. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong; on the other, chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, and all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off their subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. So we hear here Bentham's description again of a very empirical pain and pleasure motivation of behavior. Bentham concluded that we might be able to predict behavior by doing a sort of hedonistic calculus, taking into account the pleasure and pain and potential of each action, and that would in fact serve to forecast an individual's behavior. Now, building on the work of Bentham, James Mill felt that everything from education to the penal system, the legal system, everything should be structured around principles of associationism. And it turns out that he used these principles of association to teach his son, John Stuart Mill. Now, this is an interesting story in itself. because John Stuart Mill went on to become a philosopher in his own right, but he was taught in a way by his father that was rather incredible. By the time he was 8 years old, he had mastered Latin and algebra. He could speak Greek and read Greek by the time he was 3. Logic and formal logic by 12. He eventually had a bit of a nervous breakdown. And he also developed his own theories of the mind. Now, John Stuart Mill, differing quite a bit from his father, felt that that the mind existed in mental chemistry. So, if his father put forth that the mental elements, then John Stuart Mill felt that the elements combined together like chemical elements to create something completely new. So this was not merely two elements associating, it could be two elements reacting and manifesting something new. And this is what he referred to as mental chemistry. And John Stuart Mill really popularized this idea that was based on Bentham's utilitarianism, that the best action is the one that brings the greatest good. And John Stuart Mill also proposed something that I think is rather unique in that he put forth a model of psychology that was fashioned more like weather forecasting, about setting up likelihoods or predictability through likelihoods of potential outcomes. Again, meteorology, weather forecasting is a science, but it's not an exact science. Predictions are made based on probability, not on definite cause and effect relationships. Now, this Newtonian dream, this idea of reducing the contents of a mind down to its basic elements and lawful mental activity, modeled on Newtonian physics, this was not only of interest to the British, but also to the French. And sometimes when we talk about French who are interested in this type of epistemology or psychology, we refer to them as French sensationalists, this French sensationalism. And what we want to look at here is how the French sensationalism developed into what we call in the philosophy of science positivism. Now, positivism, the ideology of positivism in the philosophy of science, is really based on empiricism, on information coming through experience, and positivism is really, if you think of a very positive, evidence-oriented science, such as behaviorism. And behaviorism in social sciences, behaviorism, the evidence was always observable and measurable. This is what we call positivism. And the scientific method was adhered to in a very rigorous way. Now, the ideology of positivism is a very, very strong scientific, evidence-based, empirical way of doing science, really rooted in this empiricist tradition. And there's a form of positivism, a belief in science and the positivistic methods of science that can become, in certain thinkers, very dogmatic, very rigid, and in its own right, become almost like a religious belief. And we refer to that in the philosophy of science, or in critical science. We refer to this as scientism. Scientism. So when we refer to scientism, this is an extreme belief in science as the only legitimate way of acquiring information, and it's really marked by a dogmatism for empirical evidence. But let's start with Julien de Metry and and work our way to the positivists, and we'll see that most of these positivists really come from Belgium and France, mostly France, in the late 18th, early 19th century. And this will conclude our exploration into empiricism. It should be pointed out that this term sensationalism to describe the French philosophers of the 18th century is really it's just a term to distinguish the cultural differences between the two groups of thinkers, the British empiricists and the French sensationalists. But really, they are all empiricists. They're all stressing the importance of experience as the basis of knowledge. In particular, sensation, through the knowledge of the senses. Julien de la Mettrie was born in 1709 and died in 1751. So this is early to mid 18th century, and he was a French physician. He was particularly interested in the relationship between individuals, a person's personality, and the food they ate. He went as far as to suggest that what one ate determined their personality. This might be a little different than how we would think of it today as possibly personality and food choices being correlated rather than having a causal relationship. But this is also a trend in French thinking at the time, an interest in eating habits and food choices and an individual's character type or personality. 1745, de la Mettrie wrote The Natural History of the Soul, and it really focused on this relationship between mind and body, as Descartes had pointed out, this idea that the thought of food could bring out certain emotions and feelings and thoughts and actions in an individual. There were quite a few individuals and researchers at this time that were looking into the relationship between food and personality, most certainly in France. But La Mettrie's most famous text came out in 1748. It's called L'Homme Machine, which translates to Man Machine. And here we really see La Mettrie ushering in a very Newtonian, lawful, mechanistic view of the human mind. In the conclusion of Mettrie's text, Man, a Machine, he says, "Let us then conclude boldly that man is a machine, and that in the whole universe there is but a single substance differently modified." So here we see a very extreme version of humans as automatons. Not unlike many contemporary neuroscientists, La Mettrie was a monist. He felt that even thoughts could be reduced down to substances, to material substances. Very much interested in personality. Listen to La Mettrie on animals and human intelligence. "I shall draw the conclusion which follows clearly from incontestable observations. First, that the fiercer animals are, the less brains they have. Second, that this organ seems to increase in size in proportion to the gentleness of the animal. Third, that nature seems here eternally to impose a singular condition, that the more one gains in intelligence, the more one loses in instinct." So we're seeing here even early comparative psychology, what today we might even refer to as evolutionary psychology, put forth by Julien de Metry. Metry even speculated on what he felt could be the difference between human and non-human animals, which was education. He said, "Among animals, some learn to speak and sing. They remember tunes and strike the notes as exactly as a musician. Others, for instance the ape, show more intelligence and yet cannot learn music. What is the reason for this except some defect in the organs of speech? In a word, would it be absolutely impossible to teach the ape a language? I do not think so." 1748 this was written. We know now that certain primates can be taught rather large vocabularies through sign language, although the apparatus for for speaking language is not present. Metri writes, such is the likeness of the structure and functions of the ape to ours that I have very little doubt that if this animal were properly trained, he might at last be taught to pronounce and consequently to know a language. Then he would no longer be a wild man, nor a defective man, but he would be a perfect man, a little gentleman, with as much matter or muscle as we have for thinking and profiting by his education. So de la Mettrie certainly puts a lot on environment. He puts a lot on learning and empiricism. Finally, de la Mettrie proposed that if we stop viewing human beings as some sort of special event and began to view ourselves as animals and how we relate to the animal world and through drives and desires and actions, that we would become much better at understanding our own motivations and behaviors. So we see here really an early evolutionary psychologist. Perhaps the most prominent representative of positivism would be Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte was French, born in 1798, died in 1857. He was born in Montpellier and grew up in the area during the French Revolution, which just after the French Revolution of 1789 to 1799. Comte can be considered as the consummate positivist. Only science is valid, according to Comte. He had extremely what we'd say dogmatic views of science, dogmatic belief in science. Only publicly observable events were legitimate for study. There was no discussion of the mind. It was really like behaviorism would be in the 20th century. His real goal was to make psychology or social sciences something like a physical science that really relied on observable and measurable data. Between 1830 and 1842, he spent time writing 6 volumes. It's a course of positive philosophy. This text is still available and is very interesting to read. He also went on to write a system of positive politics. Now, this is interesting because Comte actually took on the role as like a high priest, almost a high priest of science. He really suggested that the French flag be turned into a flag that reflected science, an atomic symbol. He designed special clothing and uniforms that were very, we say, modern looking, very scientific, very minimalist in contemporary terms. And he also felt that religious holidays should be abolished and instead we should have Newton Day and things of this sort to celebrate various scientists. We're talking about a political system, a culture completely based on science. Comte put forth the idea that cultures progress through 3 stages, and this is very important for us to remember. Those 3 stages, he said, all cultures begin with a theological stage. They then enter into a metaphysical stage, and finally, the ultimate stage of a culture is its scientific stage. So we could understand this from our previous discussions as going from a mythos to a logos, and then the logos going into a positivistic science. So going from theology or myth to metaphysical, which would be philosophy of rationalism, to a scientific positivism, which is the final and ultimate stage of culture. So we see here that Comte really prided and privileged science over any other way of knowing. Finally, we look at Ernst Mach. Mach was very much in spirit with Comte and his positivism, but they did differ in one important way, at least. For Mach, we never came into contact with the physical world. It was always a mental phenomenon. And the job of the scientist in psychology or the social scientist would be to note which sensations typically cluster together. Now, in closing, let's keep in mind that Auguste Comte is considered by certain sociologists and social scientists to be the father of sociology, the father of science, of social science. And there is another figure that is certainly worth looking into, and that's the Belgian Adolf Quetelet. And in our next episode, we're going to have a special exploration of Quetelet's influence on contemporary social science. Thanks for listening.